Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Sugget, and I'm the Executive Director of CARSP, or the Canadian Association of Road Safety Professionals. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is entitled Centering Disability in the Design and Implementation of Cycling Infrastructure with Dr. Ron Buehling from the University of Toronto. So I will get to him in a minute and introduce him to you. But first, I'd just like to talk a little bit about CARSP and the fact that we do have these monthly webinars on all different types of topics. And we do open them as well to non-CARSP. They're free to CARSP members. And for non-CARSP members, we charge a nominal $50 fee. But joining CARSP is also very affordable. It's just $125 a year, and that gives you access to these free monthly webinars. I also wanted to mention that we will be taking a break from the webinars in June, July, and August. And that is because we have our conference next month as well. Staff need a break over the summer, and a lot of people are away and so forth. But we will be starting them back up in the fall. So keep your eyes peeled for the topics that we'll be having webinars on. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is the fact that we do a post-webinar survey. So we just want your feedback on today's webinar. Also, if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover in future webinars, we'd like you to give us those ideas. And lastly, if you have any a desire to deliver a webinar, we'd love to hear from you. And to sweeten your incentive to take part in the post-webinar survey, to do that, we have a $25 Tim Hortons gift card that we will be doing a draw for. And we do those every 3 months. And this is the third month. So we will be doing the draw and posting those results in the next few business days. So now I'll just do a couple of housekeeping updates. So first of all, we do entertain questions, but we do so at the end of the presentation. And we ask that you post your questions in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And you can do that at any time throughout the presentation. But once again, we will answer them at the end. And without further ado, I will now introduce us to today's speaker, which is Dr. Ron Buehling. Ron Buehling is a University of Toronto Distinguished Professor in the Geographies of Disability and Ableism. He is a faculty member in the Department of Geography, Geomatics, and Environment at the University of Toronto's Mississauga location, and holds graduate facility appointments at the University of Toronto in the Department of Geography and Planning and in the Rehabilitation Sciences Institute. He is the former graduate chair of the Tri-Campus Graduate Programs in Geography and Planning. His broad research and teaching interests have included planning for cycling and disability in cities. So welcome, Ron. You've got the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's get my screen going here. Yeah, before I begin, I just want to take a moment to thank CARSP and Brenda and Homa in particular for their assistance in getting us all here today. And I want to thank all of you for your interest in this topic, which is near and dear to my heart, both academically, but also personally, as you'll soon learn. So the title slide here tells a little bit of the story. Here is a picture of, sorry, just one second. Construction noise. On my left is a photo of me taking my planning students out and about to look at cycling facilities in the city of Toronto a few years ago. In the center here, we have folks from the Detroit Bike Share program. And I like to use this image here because it kind of gets you thinking maybe a little bit differently about the so-called design cyclist, the typical cycling body and technology or the combination of those two around which we might design our cycling infrastructure, thinking about height, width, and so on, and length. And then over here is a photo of my daughter in the power wheelchair, and my other daughter here, and we're going to go through a case study that involves this particular image a little bit later. So this is the outline for the talk today. I'm going to talk a little bit about disability, because I'm sure all of you have brought with you today your own ideas about what disability is, what it means to you, how it's defined, maybe what it means politically, and how maybe you've seen it represented in the media and elsewhere. And then I'm going to approach two case studies, one focusing on physical disability, and then looking at a case involving blind and low vision folks. I may talk about transit interactions, concluding remarks, and then we'll have our Q&A. We'll see how quickly we end up going through things. I may not be able to cover all of this. But before I dig in, I want to talk a little bit about my relationship to cycling. I have a lifelong relationship with cycling. I think sometimes when I've entered in a conversation about disability and cycling infrastructure, there can be a tendency for folks to assume that I'm starting from a place that's just simply focused on critique. You know, all of us who are here today are many different things. So I'm a cyclist. Sometimes I'm a driver. Sometimes I'm a pedestrian. I'm the parent of a disabled child. I'm the parent of two other daughters, and so on. And I also have. I'm not wearing my hearing aids right now because I don't need them for this type of activity, but I also have a hearing impairment, which affects the way that I move around the city. So as part of the prep for today's talk, earlier this week, I did a little bit of field work. And, you know, I love that I can do this in my city. So on the left-hand side there, you can see my route that I posted to Strava, and all of that was done on city cycling infrastructure, particularly cycle lanes or cycle tracks. That's something that I couldn't have done in the city of Toronto when I first moved here in 2006. As a result of the presence of this infrastructure, my risk perception is quite low, riding in those spaces in comparison to riding, if I were riding in those spaces using the same routes before the installed facilities. So I'm very grateful to the city's cycling committee for all of the work they've been doing, the design and build. The images that you see here are along the cycle track along Bloor Street, and there's a slightly beveled curve, which I'm going to come to a bit later when we're talking about blind and low vision. So my and our story. So my youngest daughter has a clinical diagnosis of spinal muscular atrophy. She uses a power wheelchair for independent mobility. Her life experience and my experience as a parent, I'm certainly not a proxy for her and her experience, inform and my work and sort of motivate my work. A few years ago, I was curious as a result of sort of walking around the city with my daughter and noticing her relative height, or her height relative to things like pedestrian countdown timer buttons and things of that nature. I was curious to look at the literature to see what was written about pedestrian injury and disability, right? And we ended up publishing a scoping review, and we found that studies consistently demonstrated greater risk of pedestrian collision, hospitalization, fatality among disabled persons. In some cases, 2 to 5 times greater risk, which is phenomenal. I mean, if we were talking about something else, we might be screaming up and down to try to do something, right? The latest data from the Canada Survey on Disability indicates that 27% of Canadians 15 years or older indicate having one or more disabilities. So this situation is pretty serious, right, for a relatively large segment of the population. Couple of other notes, you know, my daughter is not a special interest group. She has very clear ideas about what works and what doesn't work in our city. And her life in our city, and where all of us are sitting today, really kind of sit within an evolving web of disability legislation. Moving from the global to the local, we have the UN CRPD. Canada signed on to in 2010. We have Canada Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Canada Human Rights Act, and so on and so forth. The Accessible Canada Act in 2019, Ontario Human Rights Commission. I mean, the reason I have this slide up here is just to make the point that everything that we do in cities is actually sitting within a pretty fascinating, interconnected and scaled rights-based context. In the province of Ontario, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act and the related integrated accessibility standards from 2005. These have been reviewed a couple of times. The 2012 amendments, the Ontario Building Code Planning Act, the Building Code Act of 1992. All of that said, cycling infrastructure is really poorly represented, if at all, in most of the legally binding standards. Guidelines are great, but they are not legally binding standards. So what you find, and this actually came up in a conversation I had yesterday, is that you have a lot of variability both within and across cities, across provinces, in terms of what people are doing in terms of the design and build of cycling infrastructure and the way that disability is or is not centered in that conversation. Just a little bit of context here. You know, the federal charter, there was a not insignificant fight to get disabled persons included as a protected group in the revision to the federal charter in 1982. And then it's really not until, in most provinces, the 2000s, where we have provincial level disability legislation that's centered on sort of design and build issues and so on. And I just like to put the question out there, like, why was there such a lag? What was going on that produced this waiting game? So the examples that I'm going to use today are largely focused on the City of Toronto and Toronto Cycling Network, which has grown in leaps and bounds, again, during the first 2 decades of the century. I'm still getting used to wrapping my head around thinking about framing time and dates in those terms. And in particular, the examples that I'm going to talk about focus on cycle tracks and bicycle lanes. So bicycle lanes in particular, in this case, I'm talking about lanes, painted lines. The example that I'm going to be looking at is a non-buffered, I think it's a non-buffered bicycle lane. And one of the other cycle tracks, there may be some grade separation between sidewalk and the cycle lane or not. Right. So moving on to thinking about disability, you know, as you can imagine, as an academic working in this space, I've paid close attention to the question of what is disability. And really, you know, there's been half a century of writing about what disability is. Even more, it really depends upon how far you want to go back. But for the purpose of this presentation and much of my work, I like to kind of introduce people who aren't aware of different ways of thinking about disability to the social model, particularly when we're talking about cities and infrastructure. I think it has a fairly nice application. So, you know, there's the individual model or the medical model of disability, which really tends to focus on the clinical situation of the individual, where disability is thought of as a problem that's internal to the person. The person is the problem, not the context or the setting within which that person conducts their everyday lives. Social model tends to focus more so on these external factors, institutional, societal, attitudinal barriers, barriers in the built environment. So when we're thinking about cycling infrastructure, when I think about all of this, I'm thinking about, you know, what are we doing? Are we building barriers? Are we building risky spaces when we're building cycling infrastructure? Keeping in mind that, yeah, I'm 100% on board with the quest and the need to develop cycling infrastructure in our cities as part of a mechanism for dealing with the transport contributions to GHGs and climate change. As an example, as a social model example, I like to use this particular piece of infrastructure in the west end of Toronto. This is the Wallace Avenue footbridge. which was built in 1907 as a temporary fix to connect these two neighborhoods. It never got torn down, and I'm grateful for that. It's quite an interesting piece of pedestrian infrastructure. However, if you're in a wheelchair, physical disability, it presents an insurmountable barrier, the steps and so on. So you can't really use this facility. So what that means is you have to travel up to DuPont Street down here, or further down south to Bloor Street down here. And so you have a piece of infrastructure installed in the environment. I'm thinking about this historically as well, that ends up producing differential patterns of navigation in the city, depending upon what is happening with an individual, right? Producing or exacerbating a disabling experience. Some folks get to spend less time crossing into the neighborhoods than others. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about language, identity, and representation. Many of you probably came to this conversation today familiar with the sort of person with disability way of describing disability, putting the person first. This is what we often see in the media and in rights-based discourse. And then there's also identity first language, which is putting disability first. So using the phrase disabled person instead of person with disability. I'm using here the example of autism, and keeping in mind that like symbols are also a type of language. And so there's actually been some discourse and discussion about the problem of using the puzzle piece in representing the autism communities, because puzzle is sort of infantilizing. And so others have moved towards using the infinity sign for autism as opposed to the puzzle. So there's there can be a very complex language piece when we're talking about city planning, infrastructure, community engagement, and disability. And the thing that I know that the Rick Hansen Foundation suggests using the platinum rule, which is kind of meeting people where they're at and using the language that they prefer and sort of identifying themselves. So throughout the talk, I may use person with disability or disabled persons. I refer to myself as someone who's hearing impaired. Other folks might refer to themselves in other ways. And just as a quick note, rights-based definitions of disability tend to focus on the individual or medical model. If we're looking at the Ontario Human Rights Code, the definition of disability that's in there is exactly the same as the definition of disability that's embedded with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And in his 2019 review, the Honorable David Onley, who's since passed on, called for an updated and more flexible definition of disability that looks at the broader set of external factors that produce or cause disability. The other thing that we need to talk a little bit about is ableism. So ableism being beliefs or practices or the privileging or giving primacy to a particular bodies, ways of moving, ways of thinking, and so on, in the way that we do things. And in my view, sort of ableism is a precursor to the production of disability, in the sense that the privileging of non-disabled bodies and the design and build of cities ends up producing disabling experiences for disabled persons. All right, cases. Let's move on to bikeways and pedestrian interactions. We're going to start with physical disability. This is a case that sort of arises from personal circumstances. So this is a location in the Annex neighborhood of the city of Toronto near Spadina and Bloor. This here is Trinity St. Paul United Church. It's a site where my children have done certain activities over time, and we've used this disabled parking space here. So what the disabled parking space adjacent to bike lanes, the painted bike lane here, it's not an Uber Eats parking space. It's not a space for non-permitted vehicles or a taxi stand. And it needs to be long enough for a rear loading van and probably close enough for a side ramp, which I'm going to come to in a moment. For people who are planning on-street disability parking, one of the things that you could do, which is really low-hanging fruit, is clarify for the public and private operators this issue of where their vehicle can be located when engaged in side access and egress for disabled passengers. In other words, in the city of Toronto, you can unload from a side loading vehicle directly to the sidewalk. The van can pull up right to the curb, deploy the ramp onto the sidewalk. Alternatively, what I've seen is taxis unloading folks directly into the bike lane, which is troubling, right? I mean, if we're looking here, if I'm unloaded into the bike lane, I have to come all the way back to the curb cut to enter the pedestrian clearway. So what happened with us when we use this space? Well, we have a rear loading van, so my daughter has to back up just to turn 180 degrees and is facing the vehicular right of way, and oncoming traffic, has to cross over the bike lane, and then get to the curb cut and onto the clearway. You can see in this picture here that the cyclist is actually looking away from where my children are walking. I'm actually behind them at this point, kind of trying to guide them to safety. This was early on, one of the first times that we used that space, so I was unsure of how it was going to work for us. What could we do differently? Well, there are a whole range of things we could do differently. And some of these ideas have been floating around for a long time. These slides are from around 2016, these conceptual renderings. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to focus on this one here with the floating, floating curb, floating boulevard, and the non-flexible bollard, right, which creates a barrier against vehicular right-of-way and a pathway with pedestrian markings onto a curb cut that isn't at the end of the street, but that is adjacent to the roadway. So a second example, for those folks who aren't familiar, and this matters in this case, private adapted vehicles tend to have either side access or rear access, not both. Vehicles like Wheel-Trans, paratransit vehicles tend to enable both side and rear entry for disabled persons. So another option is the so-called Vancouver Corner. Vancouver Corner basically is the relocating of the on-street parking to the side street, to the adjacent side street, so that the disabled pedestrian doesn't actually have to cross, doesn't have to enter the vehicular right-of-way on the major or minor arterial, does not have to cross over the bike lane, and can just enter the clearway directly from the local street. So it reduces the number of times the disabled person has to interact with another mode of transportation, reduces the risk, reduces collision risk, and so on. If I go back to this example, so if I'm looking at the floating, the floating island with the bollard, we could place something here, and we could have the curb cut here, right? And probably extend the parking space a little bit so it's long enough to accommodate the van with the rear loading ramp. Alternatively, we could just move the on-street parking to the local side street here, right? And then someone can just go from here onto here. So I'm using this as an individual case. This is a case that sort of repeats itself in different settings, probably in various Canadian cities, and certainly across the city of Toronto. And so one of these options obviously has a much lower cost. One of them involves paint, basically, but also would require some consultation with residents in the neighborhood. And that's where you tend to find what I experience as a frustrating level of resistance, because people don't want to give up on-street parking spaces. They don't necessarily want to give that over to a spot that requires a permit, disability permit for use. Moving on to blind and low vision folks. I think I'm going to cover this and then jump to my discussion, including slides, a matter of time. Some of you may have come across a story in the CBC and other places. Dave Lepofsky was sharing his experience of trying to negotiate an at-grade install of a bike lane against pedestrian boulevard with a demarcation using pavers. See them here. And he was noting that it's difficult to cane detect the pavers and therefore possible for a blind person or someone with low vision to navigate directly into the cycleway, which has all kinds of possible implications for cyclists and pedestrians. In sort of some consultation with disabled folks around the efficacy of unit pavers, there's really sort of a mixed level of response about whether or not these are truly cane detectable enough. And there are alternatives like attention, tactile wayfinding surface indicators, and less so in this case, guidance TWSIs. Notably, there's a bit of a governance mess up there in West Toronto in terms of who was sort of responsible for what at what point in time in terms of the design and build of that facility. And the city is no longer, as a best practice, engaged in using unit pavers as a way to demarcate separation between pedestrian and cycling facilities. In fact, they're using the beveled curve as an alternative. Following consultation with the blind community. This sort of popped up in my LinkedIn yesterday, the continuous sidewalk. This is an example from Kitchener. It's kind of interesting. I noted a few things that could be done to improve this design in terms of thinking about just the way that disabled folks might navigate it. So I don't have time to get into why everything is the way it is, but the bike lane width is quite narrow if you go back to thinking about the design cyclist idea, and some of those vehicles are quite wide. There's no textured surface of any kind to demarcate and change in use from the sidewalk to the cycle lane. They're at grade. There's an attention TWSI here to indicate that a blind person is about to hit an intersection. So this is like a normal intersection here, and so they've got the sidewalk continuing across it instead of having zebra stripes or anything of that sort, right? And then so there are a few things that could be done to make this a better to clarify navigation for blind pedestrians and also reduce collision risk for others. Let me see, where am I at here? I've got about 8 minutes. A little bit of a thorn in my side is sort of what I call the problem with virtual design. So that, time and time again, when I look at conceptual renderings of transport infrastructure, I can pick apart all of the moments where there are problems where the rendering is clearly not taking into account the possibility that blind or physically disabled pedestrians might be using the space. Again, in this case here, there's no textured surface demarcate a change in use between what's going on in the clearway here, the boulevard, and the bike lane. So often when you look at these things a little bit more closely through a disability lens, you see some room for improvement, which is really what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about like, oh, we shouldn't do anything. What I'm saying is, let's do things, and let's center disability in how we do those things to make our infrastructure work for a wider section of the population. So the city of Toronto has moved away from pavers to the beveled curve option, which you see here. This is the photo I took when I was doing my field work, which is cane detectable, right? And then looking at transit bike integration, I'm not going to have time to get into this in a lot of detail today, but there are a few things that are commonly used, like the attention TWSI to demarcate the entire space of the boarding platform, including the front and end sections of the ramp. The ramp, the elevation, and signage all indicate to the approaching cyclists that they're meant to yield to the pedestrians. Although I noticed in this case, the cyclist is in full pursuit. That's been quite slowed down yet. And then there's also boulevard island stops, which I'm happy to talk about later. The City of Toronto has been working with ZEEKLA and their vectorial system, which I think is a really fascinating design intervention here, where you're installing a quasi-temporary ramp feature that enables the bus to approach boarding passengers without having to enter into the bike lane, right? So here's an example from relatively close to my neighborhood. You have the yield sign. We don't want cyclists going up there, so cyclists can enter the ramp here, bus can stop here to pick up passengers. And you have the TWSI, the attention TWSI, demarcating the boundaries of the boarding platform. All right, some final thoughts in our rapid fire tour. Design cyclists. The cyclist operating envelope. This is an image that I took from the draft bikeway design guidelines in the City of Toronto. And if you go back and think about my title slide, there's so much variability in terms of the height and width of cycle technology that may be used by disabled and non-disabled riders. I've written a bit about this sort of thing as well, disability and cycling technology. And so you might want to be thinking about that width issue and accommodating a wider range of vehicle types. Of course, I think it's about time. I'm really excited that when I'm moving around my city, I can see all kinds of attempts to incorporate features that support disabled pedestrians and disabled cyclists in engaging in active transportation, right? There's also this issue, which I suspect some of you have come across. It's called different things: disability tension, disability friction, competing disabilities. Like, all for one does not mean one for all. Like, you can engage in an intervention and it ends up creating potentially a bit of a challenge for somebody else. And you'll find a lot of writing about this in the literature. There are issues with storefront ramps, the impact of precipitation on the friction or the slippery qualities of the TWSI on a slope and so on. In terms of technology for blind pedestrians, consistency is key. So when you're doing something in one part of the city, implementing things in one particular way, like having consistent implementation is really, really important. Fixing things after the fact, whether we're talking about disability or anything else, is expensive. Retrofit is costly. You're interrupting what's happening in the pedestrian space on more than one occasion, and so on, to fix something that you might have been able to address from the very beginning. I don't think it's terribly useful. In my conversation with the city yesterday, like, one of the things we don't want to do is degenerate into a conversation where we're pitting different communities against one another and then end up in some sort of stalemate where nothing gets done. Particularly since, as I said at the outset, many of us occupy several identities simultaneously. So a couple of things that I want to end with here. Think about what happens in cities. Cities are always a work in progress. They're never done, right? And when something is done, usually by the time it's done, there's probably a new way of doing it. I think the key is, particularly in the absence of national, provincial, and even local standards around cycling infrastructure, there is a need to think carefully about what you're doing, to consult across disability communities, of which there are many, and there's a lot of difference within communities and across communities. Innovate, iterate, try things out. When something works, make it a reproducible outcome. And the other thing, like drawing on some of the reviews of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, there is some concern that there's a lack of clarity on terms and concepts. Like if you think about the start of my talk, there's many different ways to define and think about disability, right? And what does that look like downstream when we get to the point of building something in the city? In the most recent review conducted by Richard Donovan, I really appreciated his question regarding, what does success look like? How do we figure out whether or not what we've done is actually working for disabled persons? So he was really calling for, and this actually mirrors what has been said by the Chief Accessibility Officer for the federal level, is that we need more data. We need more information to look at the efficacy of outcomes. I mean, you can even think about this, and I do this in other work as a sort of healthcare quality improvement exercise, right? So you're seeing what's going on at the beginning, you engage in an intervention, and you see whether or not it's actually had a desired outcome. And the last thing I'll say is, like, the disability design in city space is quite fascinating because there's a lot of legislation around this, right? And when there isn't, there's also the charter or the Ontario, the Human Rights Code and so on and so forth, which tends to supersede all of these other pieces of legislation at other levels of government. So really it's, this conversation is about rights, justice, design, and making our cities work better for everyone. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions. Sorry, I probably went quite quickly through everything, and I'm also happy to have a follow-up chats with people if you want to reach out to me at some point. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ron. That was a great overview of the important aspects that one needs to consider in terms of legislation and working with community groups and looking at the efficacy, obviously, of different treatments, and just for bringing us up to date with what's happening in those areas. And I will now turn to our audience, and we do have a question. It's just about your slides. One person was wondering if they can have access to the slides. Is it possible we could post those, like a PDF version, or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I've pictures of my children in them.
Oh yeah, no worries. No, I completely understand. Sure.
Yeah. Oh.
And actually, another person asked for your contact information. So can we provide them with your email? That's okay. Okay, great. And they can follow.
Put it in the.
In the chat.
Chat. It's
awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So
there is a question here. There's a question in the chat. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, just let me see here. I just see a question that says, what is your contact information?
No, I've got a question here from Tom Baumgartner. It's asking, I used the term risk perception early in the presentation. What do you mean by that? So I really appreciate this question. Do you mind if I plow into it, Brenda?
Yeah, sorry, that's the chat area. I wasn't looking there, so no, I'm glad you spotted that. Thank you.
When I think about risk, I think about it's not, and I'm boring the thinking of others. I think of this as kind of an additive equation where there's perceived risk and objective risk, right? And so my qualitative experience that day when I was riding was sort of reflecting on it. I was like, yeah, I felt pretty safe, right? I don't know if I actually was objectively. I know that the literature. So I mean, if you go and you dig into the literature, which I've done in the past, and you look at this idea of risk perception, it varies in terms of identity and so many other things in regard to cycling in the city, and the perceived and objective risk varies by facility type, right? So a lot of the times, I didn't find a lot of. You sometimes find contravening outcomes across studies that look at the same facilities in different cities, right? And so you might find like multi-use trail in one study is shown to be less objectively safe than in another study. There's also the risk compensation effect, right? Which some people have written about, where I feel I'm in a bike lane, I'm wearing a helmet, and so I'm incredibly safe, and so I overpower. I ride faster than I might normally ride, and so on and so forth, which can pose all kinds of other challenges. So that's really what I'm getting at. It's like, sort of, what was I feeling in that moment when I was riding there? And as someone who studied all of this, I have to focus on my perceived risk because I'm not currently measuring my objective risk. And so a lot of these facilities are so new, it would be hard to do that. I think it's also dangerous to like just assume that you can apply what we learn in one place or one part of the city or one city to another city. Like, it's so context specific, particularly when we're dealing with infrastructure at such a sort of that's designed to build at kind of a neighborhood scale. Does that clarify, Tom? Is that helpful?
Yeah, so I'm not seeing any response from Tom. So, oh, there we are. Good. Thanks, Ronnie says. Perfect. Okay, and actually, I asked my executive administrator to come up with some questions, and she came up with some great ones because she's a PhD student in engineering. And she asks, what are some specific challenges faced by individuals with physical disabilities when using cycling infrastructure?
So I guess when you're saying using cycling infrastructure, I'm not sure if you are referring to a disabled cyclist cycling in cycling infrastructure, or if you're referring to disabled pedestrians' interaction with cycling infrastructure. I think the one way I would start to answer that question is to say, well, there's so much variation in terms of physical disability, right? Like, if you even think about, I'll come to floating bus stops in a second. You even think about the different types of disease that produce an outcome that requires somebody to use a power, or that gives someone the opportunity and choice to use a power wheelchair for independent mobility, right? You can have something like spinal muscular atrophy, which is very low muscle tone. You know, something like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which can involve both low muscle tone and tension. And so the way bodies move varies so much in terms of the clinical situation, that it's hard to kind of give an answer that covers all of the bases. But, you know, I think one of the areas that, two things. One is access and egress to facilities, like getting on and off bike lanes. Any of those points of departure and access where you're moving from one mode to another. I'm a cyclist, now I'm a pedestrian. What does that look like as I navigate that space? Are the facilities that great? Is there a step up, you know, to get my bike? Do I have the strength to actually lift my bike up onto the curb to lock it up? Or how do I negotiate that last the last mile problem there? And then also pathways. So the example that I gave of my daughter is like a pathway from the road to the pedestrian clearway. What does that look like? So I think that's kind of how I approach that question.
Okay, thanks so much. So we do have some coming in through the Q&A. So I've got here, what is the nature of the email from Barbara Gray about the adoption of chapters 1 to 3 of the Bikeway Design Guide on February 6th, 2023? That's a pretty specific question.
Yeah, well, that's just all that is the City of Toronto memorandum indicating that the on-street bikeway design guidelines have been approved. So they've gone from draft to the final version. So there's nothing else in there really other than that. It's it. I put that screen capture in there because I just wanted to acknowledge the sources that I went to in helping to develop this presentation. Mohammed had a question about the floating bus stops, and you know, I need to go back to I don't know, This is what he's talking about, right? Can you see the slides? Are they still up? This,
Yes.
this is what you mean, right, Mohammed, by floating bus stops, the boulevard? It's like sitting out there and yeah, okay. So what are my thoughts on it? Well, uh, why not? You could use the vectorial system, right? As an alternative. In this particular example, you've got a bidirectional bike lane, so it's a bit of a wider space. Incidentally, I don't know. I think folks, if I were to make a suggestion, I think we need to get a handle on signage telling cyclists which direction they're supposed to travel in, because I've seen a lot, and that can be really dangerous for pedestrians of any kind, not knowing which direction cyclists are going to come from. Particularly, we have a lot of delivery cyclists who are on heavy e-bikes that go about 30 kilometers an hour plus food bags and so on. I'm not even like the physics of that type of collision do not bode well for a pedestrian. And you see people just driving all over the place. The floating boulevard. So, this one is in pretty good shape. You've got a TWSI here. You're coming down, you're crossing the bike lane. You've got a zebra crossing here. You've got some surface treatments, signage, and so on and so forth to alert cyclists in either direction that this is a pedestrian crossing and that they should yield. But I think, if I had my druthers, like, I think I'd rather have it. I'd rather have it closer to the pedestrian right of way, right? Which is what the sort of Zikla vectorial system enables. I'm not a road engineer, so I don't entirely I think there are probably circumstances where you simply can't use that other system, but I can't really necessarily speak to that. I think the other thing too is, in this particular case, while you have the crossing nicely demarcated, you do have cyclists coming from both directions, and that's wonderful. Like, if I'm a cyclist and I'm using this space, like, that makes sense for me. It works. I'm not entirely sure that pedestrians necessarily are expecting bikes coming from both directions all the time, but in this example, everything is in place to make this space work. I hope that's sort of helpful. Pavers are, well, pavers. So what I said, so let me put it this way. In the case study, David.
Sorry, Ron, do you mind if I just read it out?
Yeah.
So the question is, you mentioned that pavers are not cane detectable. Do you have any thoughts on using trapezoidal tactile warning delineators instead? And has enough research been done on their use? Yeah, go for it. Thanks.
Okay. Trapezoidal. Just going back to Mohammed. So Mohammed's question. So first of all, if the choice is between having no bus stop, right? Like, you have to think about, oh, what do we want to have transit being accessible there, and this is how we're going to do it. Like, okay, so this is how we're going to do it. The one outcome of what I was talking about, I wouldn't want to see is for there not to be a bus there in that picture. Right. So it's about figuring out the best possible design for that particular space. And I think that's what I was trying to get at. Oh, the trapezoidal ones, these are you mean guidance TWSIs. I think that's what we're looking at here. Like a guidance TWSI. Which are, so I've got a picture of them back here. I think this is what the question is about. Oops. I just lost I lost everything.
Do you want us to put your presentation up?
No, it's okay.
You're good?
I'll put it back up. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think this is what the question is about, the guidance TWSIs. This came up yesterday as well, and I think my um, concern about it is that they're not really meant to demarcate. I mean, they're meant to provide indication of path of travel, not necessarily to demarcate a change in mode. Attention TWSI is probably a better application to alert folks to that they're moving from the boulevard or the pedestrian clearway into a cycle lane. I don't think, like, I haven't seen a ton of research on this yet, so that's a really good question. But I don't think it. I don't think it's an appropriate use when you think about what the attention TW Twizy is for versus the guidance Twizy.
We've got some more questions here, Ron. So
Yep.
In your two pictures of floating bus stops, one has tactile warning strips the whole length of the platform, while the other has them only near the bus entrance.
So I think you mean, so this one has them near the bus entrance, but and this one is around the entire platform. So these are two different types of facilities. One is the floating boulevard and the other one is the curbside ramp. This one is an asphalt ramp as opposed to the Zikla system. There's no reason why you couldn't demarcate the entire space here with an attention TWSI. I believe, and this is not quite, I think there's a slight lip there. It's hard for me to tell. And I also think that they weren't finished. The story behind the picture, and actually this is something that I wanted to mention, is that they weren't completely finished with the build out of this facility when this picture was taken. So I think something to keep in mind too is that timing is everything. There was some other pictures I excluded from the presentation because they actually represented a project that was kind of halfway to completion. So sometimes what we see happening doesn't necessarily represent the final product, which can be a bit of an issue. Anyway, yeah.
Okay. Here's a really good question. So it says, you talk about how infrastructure can have a negative impact on some groups, i.e. storefront ramps. How can we evaluate those different needs and impacts when designing infrastructure?
Well, I mean, you have to, this is true of most of the provincial legislation that I've looked at, that municipalities are required to have some kind of accessibility advisory committee. The City of Toronto has one. The TTC has one. Carefully planning the organization of those committees, looking at, I know in Saskatchewan, one of the issues was something like 50% of the members of the committee needed to be disabled. And I just wondered, well, why not 80%? Right? There's so much diversity in terms of disability and so many different disability communities. What we should be doing is making sure that we stuff these committees with folks who cover a range of disability experiences in the city, so we can have a fulsome conversation about potential impacts of different types of intervention. Otherwise, we're just flying by the seat of our pants in many ways. I've talked about this problem of disability friction in the past, and the best answer that I can come up with is making sure that you engage in genuine consultation and find out what's going to work. Is there an alternative? Helping different communities understand why. Part of it is just communication. Like, why did you do this? Why is it this way? Why do we have to have this? Why can't it be like this? And so on and so forth. And these are sometimes not easy conversations to have. And sometimes the outcome is not satisfactory for everybody. But it's important to have the conversation in the first place, and one that's inclusive of a range of experiences. I've done some work with the City of Toronto on this issue of consultation and engagement, and it's, there's a fascinating literature on that too. So, yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. So we have another question. Are the guidelines for design and operations for pedestrians and cyclists, are there guidelines for pedestrian and operations for cyclists? Sorry, I'll start again. Are there guidelines for design and operations for pedestrians and cyclists that are within the spectrum of neurodiversity and using the road infrastructure in an independent manner?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. I think in one of my earlier slides, I talked about, actually it was in the conclusion. It's about time. What about hearing, neurodiversity, and other disabilities, right? So what everybody knows, when you read, so I'll use Ontario as an example, when you read the Ontario Building Code amendments, when you read the AOTA and the IISR and all of that stuff, there's a real tendency to focus on physical disability and not really to the same extent, but blindness and low vision. Pretty much nothing about sensory disability, like hearing loss. In looking at, in our work on pedestrian injury, the pedestrian injury outcomes for folks with hearing loss are particularly troubling. And actually, so I'm working on this question of neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and different things in the city with one of my doctoral students. So we haven't found like what I would say is like a best in practice sort of set of guidelines. There are all kinds of things that are going on in our, I experience this with my hearing aids, like sound can be incredibly triggering and challenging for some individuals. And, in no way, shape, or form are our transit systems quiet. And sometimes there are interactions in those spaces that are terrible for some neurodiverse passengers and so on and so forth. So I think this is a fantastic question. It's what we need to be thinking about next. We haven't even sorted out in a very comprehensive, effective, and useful way everything that needs to happen for physically disabled persons and blind persons in the city. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking more broadly about disabilities, diversity in the context of urban design and city building. And one of the examples I like to use, the Canadian Survey on Disability, there are issues that people take with how that's set up, and it's quantitative, it's sort of post-positivist, and you're trying to put people into categories. But for sake of argument, there are 10 different categories, right? Only two of those categories are physical disability and blindness, right? So, and an individual can self-report being in more than one category. That's an incredible amount of diversity that's not captured and adequately represented in our legislation.
And I think that's a good place to finish off. And I just want to again thank you so much, Ron, for this great information. You've given us a wealth of information of what's out there right now, like what, this survey that you've just mentioned. You've also highlighted some gaps that we need to pursue. So there's obviously a lot of questions that still need answering, but at least we have a better understanding of what's out there and legislation and so forth. And I just want to also let people know if they would like to reach out to Ron to do that through me. So just email info@carse.ca, and I'm happy to give you Ron's, or actually, I guess he did also put it in the chat. So you can just look up his email address right now and reach out to him individually. And also the webinar recording for this is going to be posted in the coming business days. If you'd like to watch it again or refer it to another person, Also, just one more time, I'm going to remind you about our post-webinar survey. Please take a minute to fill that out. You have a chance to win a $25 Tim's gift card. So once again, thank you so much, Ron. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks a lot. And the questions were absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed today's session. So, okay.
Excellent.
Take care, folks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.